Hi, I'm Michelle Fenton, and welcome to the Happitecture podcast. What would it take to develop resilient, sustainable communities? How do we design cities that support our collective happiness? Join me as my guests and I discuss how we can plan, implement, and foster places that allow us to flourish and grow. We're pleased to bring you this special two-part episode of Happitecture, where we join landscape architect and urban designer Derek Lee, partner at PWL Partnership. Excuse the noise as we decided to take this podcast recording outside in one of Derek's most treasured projects, Olympic Village. Due to the coronavirus, we couldn't do this in the studio, so we opted to take a walk around Olympic Village, and hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to join us for part 2. Yeah, so we have Derek Lee from PWL Partnership, Landscape Architects, here with us today at the Happitecture podcast. Thanks, Derek, for being here.
Nice to be here.
I should say that we are outdoors because of COVID, but I think it's a great opportunity to be in one of my favorite of your works, Olympic Village. I think a lot of people know your work throughout the city and certainly in BC as some of the most top-end, popular and well-loved public spaces in the city. So it's such an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And it is certainly an honor to be here. The first thing I'll say is this environment that we're in at Olympic Village was basically the culmination of many efforts on many people's part as a broader collective team. Mm-hmm. And, I started this work back in probably 2004, 2005. And even then, there was probably about 5 years of planning that had already started on this. But it was a really interesting journey because we had an amazing team. It was an integrated design team of professional consultants, but also really close relationship with all departments of the city. Mm-hmm. And when you're thinking about designing a whole community like this, including the public spaces, and trying to innovate, it's really important that that team gels and that you're really working together. I mean, we were working on a weekly basis with the city. Yeah. I mean, we had a studio there at the city, and we were literally working there a lot of the time. So it was really exciting, and coming out of that, obviously, was this, which, is quite unique for the city of Vancouver, in terms of the urban density, in terms of the sustainability approaches we took, the unique public open spaces that are here. We're sitting right now at Olympic Plaza, which came out of the framework plan, but also the way that we envision the waterfront by incorporating ecology and merging that with the industrial context of
that's
the site.
Certainly one of the more unique aspects of it, of the entire planning, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
It seems to come in very seamlessly as part of the public infrastructure.
Yeah, and that was the idea, is we wanted to create something that didn't feel like an imposition on the site, but that honored kind of the past history of the site. I mean, there's certain patterns of development that were here prior to this, like the alignments of the industrial inlets that we kept. Recognizing the plaza here used to be a slipway, a barge channel that the barges would come in with the big piles of salt that would then be distributed into the salt building, the big red salt building that is now Kraft. And so that whole framework, that imprint we wanted to celebrate, and of course the retention of these historic buildings as a result of that.
Well, certainly when you talk about this project, and certainly when I've talked to you in the past about your work, there's a passion there, and to me it's always so wonderful to talk to you because the passion has maintained itself over many years and decades of doing this work.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to start where did this come from? And how do you keep that passion for the promotion of quality urban spaces?
I think the most passionate aspect of this for me is I'm not doing this for myself. This isn't driven by one's own desire to create great design for one's own interest. It's really coming from designing great places for the broader benefit of the community, right? And there's, even though I tend to thrive within kind of the early planning and design, conceptual design stages, there's nothing like seeing something built and seeing people interact with an environment that they were participants in planning and envisioning. That's right? Yeah. And even though this was probably 15 years old, in terms of the process where we started, we've continued to see that process evolve in all of our projects. And we just talked about this over coffee, was this idea that, when we begin to engage with participants, with the public, with the citizens of a place, oftentimes what's beneficial is just to start from a blank canvas. Start with no preconceived notions, and really just listen. Just take it all in, because we, even though we're professionals at what we do, we're certainly not the experts of that place.
Yes.
It's the people that live there, that interact with that place every day, that are really the ones that should be driving that process.
That's right. Yeah, respects. I mean, there's a term, expert citizen and citizen expert, and I think that's one of the things that's starting to show up a lot in planning, certainly as an architect, and even in the interior design work that I do.
Right.
To me, that's one of the most crucial parts, is that the concept of this is a team sport in a way.
Yeah.
And that when you have a varying perspective, there's a richness to a space and a belonging that people can have because they've contributed, or they see themselves represented in the design process.
Absolutely.
And I think certainly from the Happitecture podcast point of view, that's one of the things we want to advocate, is that this understanding that the public and the end user have as much agency over the space that's being designed for them.
Yeah.
As the designer, who's really the facilitator of, all of these layers of interactions, layers of desires, layers of history, and looking forward in the future as to how, we live in a very diverse city, so a design coming from one head is no longer seems appropriate. So
totally.
So we're here outside distance because of COVID, and in a way it's kind of nice to be able to be in the space that you've had such an intimate knowledge of. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit of how you've seen COVID change the idea of public space. And certainly it's shown itself to be very important, because now that we have to be outside in distance, quality public space, but quality public space is now a really critical part of how we maintain health and well-being in our cities. And so from a post-pandemic point of view, what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of how we need to rethink urban space, public space?
Well, I think what was really apparent to me was this summer, walking through the parts of our city. And even though the shopping malls were closed, by and large, the restaurants were very low capacity and closed, and some of these other places that we normally frequent, walking through the parks, they were just, filled with people.
Yes.
And
it was remarkable.
It was
to me
totally
too.
Remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah. And even just over here at Hinge Park, where you have the open lawn, people were so meticulously spaced apart, but every square area of that park was filled with people. Mm-hmm. People couldn't travel. You couldn't hop on a plane and travel to another country or do that sort of traveling. So people realized that they could make the most of their public spaces locally. And I think that was a real revelation for people, that there was the ability to experience a sense of joy in our own spaces. And I'm sure that people were exploring, certain areas of the city, perhaps locally, that they maybe had not considered otherwise.
Certainly, yeah.
Right?
Certainly I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a real revelation. And I think it opened people's eyes to the value of public space and what it means to be able to value that well after the pandemic.
Right.
The other thing that I think the pandemic has shown us is keeping things local from a community perspective too. And, one observation that I've had, and I've now been working at home for 9 months.
Yeah.
Our company's doing very well, but we're all by and large working at home.
Yeah.
Is that we tend to be walking around our neighborhoods more. We tend to be maybe frequenting the local coffee shop during the day rather than downtown.
Yeah.
And so what we're beginning to see are these public spaces in our neighborhoods beginning to thrive.
Right.
More than maybe just that whole commuting to the urban center.
Yeah.
We talk about the 15-minute city. I'm advocating for the 15-minute neighborhood rather,
Right.
but I'm advocating for the 5-minute neighborhood
Right.
because that's exactly
Yeah.
how we can be interacting and building those connections with our neighbors
And certainly that goes not to just an enjoyment in where you live, but certainly from a resiliency point of view in terms of maintaining financial stability within those neighborhoods.
That's right, yeah.
That you actually invest back into those neighborhoods, and perhaps that strengthens the importance of public space and the design of public spaces, even within smaller communities.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost a guerrilla take back of
Yeah, and I mean we've certainly seen it in our neighborhoods,
Yeah.
right? Like I live at Canby Village, between Canby Village and Douglas Park, and we talk about tactical urbanism, and we've seen a lot of initiatives by the city to close down side streets, make more space for outdoor patio spaces, places for people to interact, and now that those spaces, a lot of those temporary closures have been in place for several months. It's funny how a short time can pass and you can barely remember that it was a street that you'd be driving through.
Absolutely.
And I think for a lot of people, they're like, yeah, why would we change this
That's
now?
right. Yeah.
Right?
That certainly talks to the opportunity of a crisis, and I think that, when in the middle of the pandemic in the summer, one of the joys I had was cycling around Stanley Park on the road.
Yes, me too.
And that's what I mean. Like there are certain aspects of public space that as citizens we've claimed.
Yeah.
We've owned it and we've claimed it, and now we're looking to demand that those qualities are maintained.
That's
somewhat.
right. Yeah.
And there's a certain richness to that, because now you're layering intention of the people who actually use the space onto that space, and those spaces become transformed. Certainly Stanley Park was transformed when teams of cyclists were just going up those. Some were walking up, frankly, but it was incredible. I'd never seen anything like that in the city.
Oh, that was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was there like every Sunday morning. I was doing my loop around Stanley Park, and even going along Beach Avenue.
Yeah.
Right. So now they have that sort of one-way loop beach to Robson. So
That's right.
The other half of the street is actually closed to cyclists and pedestrians now to use, and it's human nature. Right.
Yes.
I think that we often get set in our ways, and oftentimes it needs a little bit of a shake-up.
That's right.
In this case, it was COVID.
Yeah.
To allow us to think about our environments differently. Yeah. And you want to seize those opportunities. And
That's right.
It would be a shame to see it kind of go back to the way it was.
Yeah.
If people felt that this was a big improvement.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a certain democracy to that too.
Yeah.
When I think about the wide range of social, economic, cultural demographic that have actually started to claim the public space.
Yeah.
Really driven from the fact that restaurants had to close out, and all these malls had to close, and so that culture got driven out onto the street.
That's right.
And there's a real equality about that, because you don't have to pay $5 to go grab a coffee in a fancy restaurant, or $20 meal. You can actually bring your home cooked meal and sit outside with everyone else. So that's one of the things I noticed and appreciated about the claiming of public space by the general public. It starts to even that curve of the haves and the have-nots in a way.
Totally. I mean, just a point of reflection, I was fortunate enough just before the pandemic to be traveling through Europe with my family. We were in Helsinki, we were in St. Petersburg, we went through the Baltics, and we found our way all the way down to Barcelona. And in each city that we visited, because I think in the European context, it's a much more mature public culture.
That's right, yeah.
It really is.
Yes.
And you see more and more people valuing and utilizing public spaces, compared to what we had been doing here.
Mm-hmm.
But when the pandemic hit and you'd be walking through the city and you'd be seeing people outside and using these spaces, you'd be like, I was like, yeah, this really feels more like what I experienced just a few months prior.
That's right, yeah.
And, sometimes society needs to evolve,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think this point is a bit of an evolution in our society of moving away from the autocentric way of experiencing our cities, which has really dominated, let's be honest, over the last century, and moving into more of this, more of a human scale form of interaction of public space, right?
And there's a natural tendency for us to gather in spaces that are designed at that scale as well. And certainly even when we look at this neighborhood, Olympic Village, the variety of scales is one of the things that I love about Olympic Village, and I think a lot of people love and adore about Olympic Village. One of the things I know was a bone of contention in the design was a lot of people were concerned about the tightness of some of the streets.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, those streets became some of the most beloved places to walk in this neighborhood because it's tight, it's intimate, it's human.
Yeah, totally. If you visit many old cities around the world, whether it's like Marrakesh in Morocco, or even, some of the smaller streets that you'd find in cities like Paris and London, they are quite tight.
Yes.
And there's a real interesting quality to them that we as North Americans are not used to.
Yes.
And so that resistance in the early planning stages of what is this going to result in? Because people were concerned that, if you lived on the fourth floor, you'd be looking through your window into the window of the guy across the street.
Yeah.
But it's incredible how closely people live and how comfortable people are living that close together. And of course, we have our spatial bubbles.
Yes.
But
we are Canadian after all.
We are Canadian, yeah. But they can be quite intimate.
That's right.
And still we find those ways of either being public or being private within those more intimate bubbles, right?
And one of the remarkable things I think you don't see in some of the other developments, and which is one of the things that I love about this neighborhood as well, is that people actually live here.
Yeah.
Compared to like a community like Cole Harbour, where it's quite dense.
Yeah.
But you don't have people live here, people rent here, people own here. It's lived in.
I remember when the Olympics came and the athletes were using these buildings temporarily. They had already been purchased by buyers prior to that. There was also the rental housing that they were living in. There was this lingering question in my mind whether it would turn into a Cole Harbour after that. And I was shocked how quickly it had changed. Within a year, people were having block parties in this neighborhood. Yeah. And that was a profound difference from a lot of these other large-scale planned communities that we've seen, And I've asked myself, well, why is that? What is it that is fundamentally different to this versus, let's say, Cole Harbour?
Right.
I think that, for one, it's I think the tenure is different here. I think one of the early planning principles of this was to have a much more balanced tenure of rental, market, non-market or market rental, more of a balance versus a lot of these other more monodemographic communities. So inherently, the land use facilitated a much more diverse group of people living here. I think also there was a commitment of a lot of the merchants that came in to there was almost an inherent critical mass and demand within this broader area here. It's close to Mount Pleasant. There's an existing urban fabric that this is tied into quite nicely. And the granularity of our planning work here, I think, is really important. And, this intricate network of public spaces, places just to be and hang out, I think are much more abundant here than perhaps some of the other communities that have been planned. And that has really, I wouldn't underestimate the power of that kind of early planning. Well-scaled spaces. We're sitting in the plaza, the Olympic Plaza here. There's sort of a stickiness to all the edges where you can sit on a patio and people watch as people are cycling and walking along the seawall and hanging out in the plaza space. There's also this sense of a constellation of these outdoor living rooms or spaces that we really worked hard to create, whether it's in the internal courtyards, the semi-private courtyards of these residential blocks, or these larger spaces, be they the Olympic Plaza or, Hinge Park and the waterfront. So, it's all about good fabric, good urban fabric, good connections with the surrounding communities. And it's been quite incredible to see this place evolve from, these few blocks, kind of now expanding out beyond.
And it keeps going, too.
And it keeps going.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about this scale of development, which feels more European. It feels more human in that context than perhaps the towers and some of these other built forms where, if you live on the 20th floor, how connected are you to the ground and to what's happening in the public domain? Whereas here, you could be on the 4th or 6th floor and you still have this connection, sort of the Jane Jacobs eyes on the street connection to the public domain. Right?
You touched on something that I want to explore a little bit more in terms of the planning and policy. And we've talked a lot about the grassroots idea that public space and communities can be designed by the people who actually use it. But you mentioned something about the policy of that sort of mixed density, that mixed use almost, rental, supported housing, market housing. And I wonder if you can, I'm not sure if you can talk a little bit about how important policy is to dovetail into public grassroots movements to create spaces that are successful.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, local governments and decision makers need to have a very innate understanding of what the community needs and wants. And that really should be the first step. I talked about this idea of just having an open listening session. Once you get that kind of feedback and those types of priorities, policy really is the foundation to ensure that success. And so using Southeast Falls Creek as an example, our first step was really, after doing iterations of planning, framework planning with input from the community, it was about creating a policy statement.
Right.
And so that policy statement that was endorsed by council in 2005, I believe, really set a few key objectives. Number one, creating one of the most sustainable communities anywhere, and that involved looking at it from a buildings perspective, looking at integrating natural systems within the public spaces, looking at social aspects that would contribute to people's health and well-being in the design of public spaces, parks, etc. And then within that policy statement, there was a very specific discussion around tenure, right? 30% affordable housing, 30% non-market housing, 30% market housing, right? There are also, in that policy statement, were very specific guidelines around the form and massing of this place, right? So we actually had a very much sort of a three-dimensional model of what the whole layout of this master plan would look like, that made its way into the policy statement. So, and it was a very accelerated process too, because shortly after that, we won the Olympic bid.
That's right.
And this had to be built by 2010. So we only had 5 years to
Which
move
is
this
a
forward.
remarkable feat in of itself.
Yeah, I mean, that was, rarely do you see that happen. And it's good that it did, because it really set in motion the success of this, in spite of the fact that, there was a lot of planning around this this site, 10 years prior, and you really needed a catalyst to move it forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the public policy part is something that we're starting to see wane a little bit in Vancouver specifically, in terms of a consolidated community planning effort. It does seem that the excitement and the collaboration that happened, the intense collaboration that happened from a lot of different parties for this particular site, hasn't necessarily been applied to community planning in the city. It's been mostly one-offs, and negotiations with specific developers, as opposed to a really collaborative, concerted effort to plan a community. We're looking at planning building sites now and not communities. And so I think the takeaway for me is, as a citizen, as an expert citizen, would be to convince our politicians or council that the success of this wasn't built on the shoulders of one developer negotiating with city planners. It took a concerted effort. It took planning. It took care. It took information, and it took all hands on deck in a way to what I think anyone anywhere in the world would say is a very successful end result, a community plan. So hopefully those that are listening to this podcast can start to communicate that. I mean, one of the things we wanted to bring out in this podcast is to actually equip the typical person, the citizen, with the language and the motivation to actually be a part of their city planning.
Thank you for listening to this Happitecture podcast. Hopefully you join us for episode 2, where we join landscape architect and urban designer Derek Lee, partner at PWL Partnership. For more information on this or any other episodes of the Happitecture podcast, you can find us at happitecture.com. happitecture.com. Special thanks to our sponsors Cora Architecture and Interiors, designing places for being. Post-production by Vanessa Hennessy.